Right. Dr. Walford, thank you very much for seeing us.
No, it's a pleasure.
And I wonder if you could explain in layman's terms what your research into longevity is.
My research has several aspects. Part of it is concerned with the molecular genetics of aging, which genes regulate aging. A part with cells in tissue culture, aging under glass, and probably the most publicly interesting part has to do with the effect of nutrition on aging. It's been known for actually a long time that if animals, and this is a wide variety of different species of animals, are fed a low-calorie but nutritionally adequate diet, that you can retard the rate of aging and extend the lifespan by as much as 20%, 50%, or even 80%. Most of the work has been done in mice and rats, so we could speak about them. Aging is stretched out. The period of youth and middle age is expanded. The diseases of aging, like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth, are moved to a later period in life, and their total incidence is less on a calorically restricted regime. So these are two of the kind of four historical phases in nutritional research on aging. The third phase, which is the one I initiated in this general area, was the effect of caloric restriction on the physiology of the body, on the immune system, on liver biochemistry, on gene expression, and matters of that nature. Most of my work has been on the immune system, and we've shown that calorie restriction largely prevents or delays the otherwise age-related decline in the immune response capacity, in the ability of the body to fight off infections and so forth. The final phase, or the current phase, of this general area of nutritional work is the search for mechanisms. What is the basic mechanism whereby merely restricting calories has these global effects on the body, influencing aging, lifespan, disease, development, and all of these physiologic parameters?
This is with rodents. Does that relate to human beings in any way?
Yes, it relates with a high order of probability to human beings. The justification for animal research, in fact, is its relation to human beings eventually. But caloric restriction has been explored and works in all the way across the animal kingdom so far, from one-celled organisms up through snails, flies, worms, and so forth, and higher up, spiders, through mice, rats, and initial results in monkeys being conducted at the National Institute on Aging seem to show retarded aging. So it is...
We may want to back up on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. How does this relate to human beings?
With a high order of probability, the work in animals is directly applicable to humans. This is really the basic assumption in animal research anyway, in all kinds of animal research. However, the caloric restriction specifically has been shown to have these effects, extending lifespan in one-celled organisms, in worms, flies, mollusks, fish, mice, rats, and in ongoing work at the National Institute of Aging, very likely in monkeys. So it seems to be what we call phylogenetically independent. It works all the way across the animal kingdom, and so it would be enormously surprising if it didn't work in humans.
Right. To define it, because one would think that if you were on, say, people who have low, at the moment, through no fault of their own, say people in Ethiopia and so forth, in Africa, who have very, very little nutrition, don't seem to live very long, basically. What's the fine difference between having a restricted diet and having a starvation diet?
The reason people in, say, underdeveloped countries where there's a lot of starvation and very low-calorie diets don't enjoy this effect is because what they're eating is nutritionally inadequate. Their diets are lacking in essential vitamins and minerals and so forth. And so that, of course, doesn't extend but shortens life. The low-calorie effect has to be balanced with fully adequate nutrition for the essential nutrients, essential amino acids, essential vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, and so forth. So it's a very select kind of regime, and you can't think about people in starving countries. No, that's not applicable.
Right. Do you think it's possible to, and now, if somebody wanted to say, well, fine, what's happening in research appears to be working, it's worth a chance, I'm going to start taking this diet myself. What would they have to eat to do it? I mean, would it be a matter of just of dieting for the rest of their life, or is it something much more specific?
Well, they have to lower their calorie intake so that they gradually lose weight over about a 4 or 5 year period. It has to be gradual to be effective when beginning in adulthood. Gradually lose weight over a 4 or 5 year period until they're 10 to 25% below their so-called set point, where the set point is what you normally weigh if you kind of eat as much as you want. Below the set point then, and that will have the effect. And what you actually eat is, well, I've written a couple of books, diet books on that, but basically it's food that's high in nutrient value, and it has to be put together in a way that on each day in the 1,500 to 2,000 calorie allotment that seems to work, let's say, for you to lose weight gradually, you reach 100% of the recommended daily allowances for all the essential nutrients. But to name specific foods, it's generally wholesome foods like a lot of vegetables, grains, not highly polished grains, but unhulled rice, for example, and things like that, and fish, vegetables, grains, fruits.
Would you take a vitamin supplement with it? Or?
Well, I think it's fine to take a moderate amount of vitamin supplements too, the recommended daily amounts of the vitamin supplements. But I think it's wrong to think that you can eat a kind of a average American or European diet, but just eat less of it and then supplement it. That's kind of a junk food diet with added vitamins, and I don't think that will work. It might work theoretically if we knew totally everything there is to know about nutrition, but when you get into that, you begin missing elements that we don't know very much about yet. So I think it's dangerous to think about doing it that way.
Right. Predicting slightly into the future, if it's proved categorically that this does work with humans, do you think we could educate mankind?
Maybe a little noise. Stand by.
Does it sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And speed.
Right. Do you think we could educate people? I mean, food plays an awful lot in our society and our culture. Do you think we could educate people to eat a low diet?
Food plays a big part in the culture, but it is possible to educate people to eat a lower diet. A lot of people are following what I have said in the books I've written and are eating in this way. I don't think everybody will. People are being educated, for example, now to eat less fat, to eat more fibers and things of that nature, and to a certain extent they do. The incidence of heart disease is going down in the United States anyway, because people are on the whole conscious of not overindulging in fats and cholesterol and so forth.
Would the diet become boring, do you think? Or is there a way, I mean, do you put, well, what I should say, sorry again, is do you take the diet, presumably you do yourself?
Yes, I've been on the a low-calorie diet for 4 or 5 years. No, it's not boring. You have to add spices and cook foods the way you like them. There's a fair amount of beans, vegetables, grains, and so forth, and they can be cooked in a quite an appetizing way. For example, the Indian diet is almost purely vegetarian. Whether you like it or not, it's variable and spicy and so forth. That's not a problem. Vegetarians generally have quite a good diet. The one I'm talking about is not necessarily a vegetarian diet, but one can prepare beans and rice and vegetables in a wide variety of ways, and it's not boring.
I would normally think of people who eat less food as having not the same sort of energy that someone who eats a full diet. Is this true or not?
No, that's not true. People on a low-calorie diet, if it's nutrient sufficient, have more energy than people who are overeating. One can see that in various, even clinical conditions. For example, in anorexia nervosa, which is eventually a fatal disease if people stay on it. But in the early stages of that, anorexics usually eat a very good diet qualitatively. They'll eat, say, 1 egg a day. something like that, which is quite nutritious, but still at a starvation level. But in the early stages, they're known to have a lot more energy than people eating a regular diet. They also have an increased immune response capacity. So you begin to see the effect of calorie restriction in the early stages of anorexia. Then it goes away because they starve to death. Low calorie, your body adjusts to it, and you have an increased metabolic efficiency. Metabolic efficiency, if everything is perfect in the body, can be up to 50%. That is 50% of your fuel you can use adequately. The rest is burned off as wasted heat or in so-called futile cycles. On a normal full diet, you only reach 35% efficiency. On a low-calorie diet, you reach about 50%. And this is converted into more energy and less wasted material floating around.
Why do you, I mean, does anyone, or have you postulated why this has the effect of diet and longevity and the immune system?
The mechanism whereby calorie restriction has these effects is kind of a big question now for, not only for me, but other people working in this area. Well, it delays the age-related decline in the immune system. That's one possibility as to mechanisms. There is, for example, an immunologic theory of aging, which that would fit into. It also upregulates the level of so-called free radical scavengers in the body. Those are chemicals produced by the body to neutralize the effects of so-called free radicals, which are injurious, hyperactive oxygen elements generated during the course of normal metabolism. Calorie restrictions upregulates the defense against these. It also increases the level of DNA repair in your body. And there is a DNA repair theory of aging. So it does about all of these things that fit in with anybody's theory of aging. It's therefore kind of difficult to select which is the primary effect, if there is a primary effect. So there are a lot of possible mechanisms. We don't know exactly which.
Should you also take them to sort of cover yourself, say, double insure yourself? Would it be sensible to take this diet plus take a free radical, an antioxidant regime of vitamins and minerals and so on?
Well, in regard to antioxidant regimes, I'm not against them. I think there's a lot to be said for some antioxidants, for example, vitamin E, vitamin C, and selenium. However, there isn't any evidence in the medical literature that antioxidants by themselves will really retard the rate of aging and extend lifespan. So while the free radical theory of aging and the taking of antioxidants sounds very plausible, there isn't any hard experimental evidence that it really works out. Whereas for caloric restriction, there's abundant evidence in the animal literature for years that it retards aging.
Right. You take it, could I ask how old you are, sir?
67.
Right. I must say you don't look it. Do you anticipate, I mean, obviously it's difficult, but at what point of your life, if you started this regime now, say at 40, where would if a bus didn't hit you, where would your natural lifespan extend to? What age would you guess?
Well, one very roughly, and this is very rough as I say, at any age that you start, if you do calorie restriction very rigorously, it will retard your rate of aging by about 50% from that time on. So let us say you started at age 40 and that your genetic potential were to live, if you were eating normally, were to live to be 80. So if you retard your rate of aging by half, then instead of having another 40 years, you'd have another 80 years. So you'd live to be 120 if you start at 40.
And would that 120, would the last part of your life, say from 70 onwards, be as an old person, or would you be younger and look younger, feel younger?
You'd be, when you were 70, you'd be about 50 in terms of what you looked like and in your general function, your intellectual capacity, your physical prowess, the wrinkling of your skin, the graying of your hair. When you were, let's say 100 or 110, you would look about what you would have looked when you were 75 or 76. So it stretches out whatever the period is, but it doesn't just add old years onto old years. So picture of getting a lot of chronologically old and decrepit people running around on a caloric restricted diet is not correct. It will produce chronologically old but functionally much younger people.
If you started this, was there an optimum age? Now, someone is looking at this program in England and they're 20 and they say, well, crikey, you know, if I'm 20, what sort of age could I possibly live to? Is there an optimum age that one should start this?
The optimum age is the younger the better, but not until one has achieved full growth. If you do caloric restriction starting in very young animals, they live longer than any other animals, but they're smaller. So I don't think that's a good choice to inflict on children. You should, people should wait till they have their full growth if they want to do this and then start on it.
So if you did it if we took our person who was going to die at 80 and he started at 20, he could presumably then live to 140 or even longer.
Yes, that's true. If you start it, if it follows along and you have to do a pretty rigorous calorie restriction regime to really come up to the maximum lifespans obtained by calorically restricted animals. But any degree of restriction will extend life a certain extent. For example, animals restricted 10% will live longer than animals that are fully fed. 20% restriction gives animals living longer than 10%. 40% longer than 20%. So the lifespan increases the more the restriction, down to about 50%. At that level and below that, then animals start dying off because there you get into the point of actual caloric starvation. So if somebody starts at 20 and they really do it tremendously rigorously, say 40% restriction or so forth, then they could live out to be 140, 160, according to the animal data. Probably people will not want to do it that heavily, but that's a personal choice.
Say you did, and you went to a party and you decided to have some apple pie and ice cream or go out with friends for a big meal one night. Would that dramatically affect it, or can you have the odd occasions where you do break the diet?
It's a long-term effect, and you can break the diet once a week or something, as long as you're, on the whole, your weight is kept below your set point.
Right. And does animal fat come into it or not?
Well,
should we now, I mean, the things that we're being told not to eat, you know, milk, butter and fatty meat, etc. Does that still apply to your restricted diet?
it's been found that calorie restriction, its effect is only dependent, or largely dependent, on the calorie content, independent of whether you have high protein or high fat or whatever kind of diet. As long as you have all the essential nutrients, it's the calorie effect that is prominent. Now, as far as the kinds of fats you eat, that's sort of a separate issue. I think that it's better not to eat too many animal fats. Also, fat on the whole are empty calories, so if you eat too many fats, you're not able to get full nutrition. But it's okay to eat animal fats and milk fats as long as you don't overdo it.
Right. Let's assume then that people do listen to what you're saying and they start to restrict their diet. How would society in the future be able to cope with I'm not saying an ill, but a healthy, aged population?
The long-living society will be a different society than the one today, and it'll produce a lot of kind of social revolution in many ways. First of all, let's think about overpopulation, okay? Adding people on kind of with longer lifespans will not in the long run have much impact on the population pressure. One can think of that in this way. If you started about 10,000 BC, there were, I think, 2 to 3 million people on Earth, and now it's going up to about 5 to 7 billion due to the over-procreation effect. If you took the same initial several million people, 10,000 BC, and optimized the longevity problem and kept the birth problem in better perspective, let's say that starting with 1 or 2 million people, everybody lived forever. Nobody died from disease or aging or anything. They were still there. Everybody had one child. Every couple had 2 children, but that was all. So how many people would you have today? about 400 million. That gives a linear increase, whereas the overbirthing gives an exponential increase. So it's the over-procreation that is the real problem, and adding people's lifespans introduces kind of a drop in the bucket. So that, I think, is not a worry. As far as the other aspects, well, people will have multiple careers in a long-living society. They'll be functionally able to start out being an artist if they were a scientist or whatever they want. It will increase the workforce, decrease the amount of non-productive years in the population. This has only really been studied or thought about by one professional economist, Larry Kotlikoff at Yale University. And his analysis is that it will actually increase productivity per capita and be economically beneficial.
But surely the West, let's assume it's all happening, it's only going to happen in the West. In the East, the birth rate's still going, and the third world, the birth rate will still expand, won't it?
I suppose, yes, the birth rate in some countries will still expand, but there's nothing I can do about that as a gerontologist. But increasing the lifespan, as I say, by itself, is not a major factor in the population explosion.
Right. Do you then see that, say, just to go back to your thing about having a second career, that at 60 you would retire and then go back to college if you wanted to become an artist after being a scientist?
Yes, I think people will have multiple careers in a long-living society. They'll have a career lasting 30 or 35 years and then probably go back to school.
And what about the personal relationships? The thought maybe of having the same mother-in-law for 100 years may daunt many people. How do you think that the family will relate to this?
Personal relationships will be greatly changed. For example, there'll be people that are 60 or 70 years old, perhaps going to high school or first year of college. So but not looking 70 years old, but still having 70 years of experience, say. So the whole generation gap will collapse and there'll be another situation. People 80 or 90 will be marrying somebody who are 30, and this will be common. So I think you have to think of a long-living society in quite different terms, and it's hard to predict exactly what it will be. There'll be very extended families, clans almost, of people who are living that long.
All our sort of images are aimed at the young, our pop music, our restaurants, cinemas, entertainment. Everything at the moment is geared towards people in their teens and 20s. Do you think if this happens, then all the images will now be geared towards a more older population?
If this happens, I think images will be geared towards an older population, yes. If they're 50 or 60 and still functionally 25 or 30, they'll have a lot of power and interest and so forth.
And do you think this would restrict, would we have to restrict the amount of children that per family had? Say in the United Kingdom, where there's 50 million people, we're a bit overcrowded anyway. If we had a...
No, we have a battery going out.
Oh, right. Okay, so, if we had an aging generation...
Sweet.
Let's sort of go ahead and maybe 20 or 30 years into the next century. Do you think at any point it would be possible to extend lifespan beyond just diet, that science will come up with another answer?
Certainly science will come up with other ways of extending lifespan. And I can't predict them. Increasing the DNA repair rate, if somebody is able to do that, that may do it all by itself. The only thing at the moment is that calorie restriction is the only thing available right now that we know will work to do it, or will work with a high order of probability. Perhaps when we discover the exact mechanism, that one can go directly to the mechanism without having to bother to eat less. Or there may be other ways that one can do it, which will come out of molecular genetic studies, which will come out of finding the right kind of antioxidants. There are problems with the antioxidant theory of aging, but maybe that's because we don't know enough about it. There are a number of other possibilities, and I think these will happen. I can't say exactly when. In 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, certainly.
If that does happen, then, would human lifespan extend? Let's say that 120 or 140 is the maximum through diet one could attain, do you think what other fields will be able to extend that lifespan dramatically past that point?
I suspect that other regimes, when we get right down to some of the basic mechanisms of aging, may extend lifespan even more than dietary restriction. The ultimate barrier is about 600 years. And the reason one can say that is that if you eliminate all diseases, cancer, heart disease, and so forth, so that people are not dying of anything and not dying of even getting old, but you still keep the accident rate. That's the only thing that causes death is accidents. Since they're in about 4 or 5% of deaths now are due to accidents, if that remains, then it can be shown mathematically that it will wipe everybody out in about 600 years.
Right.
So that you can think of as being the maximum possible lifespan, unless you live in a shell.
Right. But presumably that's only the average, so someone may go way beyond the 600 point. People inevitably will.
Well, the population curve will come down to about 0, and then there might, if accidents are the only thing killing them, could go on, there could be a long tail of just a few people. I think that's conceivable.
Well, if that happened, then obviously the thought of having your mother-in-law for 570 years might be a bit too much.
Well, I think that's one of the advantages of the long-living society, that you'll be much more careful about choosing your mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And much more careful about littering the highways, and much more careful about a lot of things that people with short lifespans just do because they don't care.
Do you think that's really true, that people's attitude is that, well, what the hell, I've got 60 years to live, I might as well go out and I don't care about anything? I mean, do you think that's a conscious attitude that people have, or is it just something that's just built into us?
I think it's an attitude, whether it's conscious or subconscious. You find a lot of changes in old people that are interesting, existing old people, if they're healthy and don't have economic problems.